Let's begin by going over the options. Object to spawn is required. Just drag whatever object you want to be spawned into this field. Diameter needed per object determines the minimum distance an object can be spawned next to another object. Spawn area size determines the size of the area where the objects can spawn. The default is 10 units in the X direction and 10 units in the Z direction. Ground height variance determines how high and low objects can be spawned relative to the spawn location. Use object pooling is a way of preserving your resources and prevent unnecessary garbage collection by reusing objects instead of deleting and creating new ones. Max spawn attempts per object determines how many times Unity will try to spawn your objects in acceptable locations. If spawn attempts exceed this value, then the object will be spawned regardless of whether the location is ideal or not. Spawn options are optional. Spawn location allows you to choose a spawn location other than the object spawner itself. Parent object allows you to choose an object in your hierarchy in which to store all the spawned objects, which can be especially helpful for troubleshooting. Spawn surface allows you to designate a surface for your objects to spawn on. If one is designated, then objects will only spawn on that specific surface. Spawn results are read-only and only useful during runtime in the editor. Most spawn attempts used will show you the max spawn attempts while your game is running. The smaller this number is, the better. Bad spawns shows you the number of objects that couldn't find a suitable spawn position in the max allowable spawn attempts. You want this value to stay at 0. Special effects are also optional. Removed particle FX is the particle effect that will be played anytime an object is removed. Removed sound FX is the sound effect that will be played anytime an object is removed. There are 2 events. Object spawned happens anytime one or more objects are spawned. Object removed happens anytime one or more objects are removed. How about a demonstration? I'll create a 3D sphere and set its position at world center. To make it a little more interesting, I'll drop a material on it. I'll use the one that looks like dark rock. I'm going to be spawning the spheres in the air and letting them fall, so I need to add a rigid body component to it. Otherwise, the spheres will just stay sitting in the air. This sphere will be our reference object that will spawn. Basically, the object spawner will make a bunch of duplicates, so we need to make sure that it's always available. You could always make it into a prefab and then use the prefab as your reference, but for this tutorial, I'll just use the sphere in our scene. That also means I need to hide it, and the best way to do that would be to put it in an empty game object and then disable the empty game object. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'll create an empty game object and make sure it's positioned at world center with my sphere. I'll call it sphere reference. Once I've given it an appropriate name, I'll disable it. Next, I'll drop the sphere into the empty game object, but I want to make sure the sphere stays enabled. Otherwise, our object spawner will be spawning a bunch of disabled spheres. Now, let's drop an object spawner into our scene and move it up to where we want our spheres to spawn. Next, I'll drag the sphere, not the empty game object, but the sphere itself, into the object to spawn field. To prevent spheres from being spawned inside of each other, I'll set the diameter needed to 10. Our ground is 96 by 96, so let's set the spawn area size to something like 90 by 90. Since our ground is flat, let's set the ground height to 1. I'm going to make sure I check the Use Object Pooling option, but I'll leave all the other options as they are, except for the Removed Sound FX. Right now, the sound effects is a pop sound, but I want to use something that sounds more like a thud when our spheres hit the ground. I'll navigate to the audio folder and drag in the ball kick audio file. It won't be perfect, but it'll surely be better than a pop. Now we need something to tell it when to spawn. Let's use a repeater for that. You can find the repeater in the Utilities folder, somewhere near the bottom. Once I find it in the list, I'll go ahead and drag one into my scene. I'll make sure Auto Start is checked so that it's going when the game starts. I'll change the min repeat time to 0.2, and I'll change the max repeat time to 0.7. Next, I'll expand the repeater repeated event and drag in the ObjectSpawner. I'll tell it to spawn objects and set the amount to 1. Before we test it out, there's one more thing I want to do. I don't want a bunch of spheres accumulating all over the ground, so let's remove them as they hit the ground. Probably the best way to do that is by using a detection area. The detection area can be found in the Utilities folder, somewhere near the top. I'll drag one into my scene, or drop one, and make sure it's at the center. I'll also make sure the box collider component is expanded so that I can see what I'm scaling up. Since I already know that my ground is 96 by 96, I'll just type in 96 into the scale X and Z values. For the Y scale value, I'll set it to something small like 0.2. Since the spheres will have momentum from falling, I want to make sure they hit the ground in order to cancel out its momentum prior to being respawned, or rather re-enabled. I want to make it so that when a sphere enters into this detection area, it's removed. An easy way to do that is to check the Detect Ball option. This will allow the detection area to detect anything that is tagged as ball. Next, I'll expand the ball entered event and drag in the ObjectSpawner and tell it to remove trigger. If something triggers the detection area and it has the tag ball, it will be removed. I'll select the sphere and then click on the tag manager at the top of the inspector and make sure it's set to ball. We can test out our scene, but before I click the play button, I'll make sure it's not on maximize so that we can see the hierarchy in the inspector while the game's running. If you look in my hierarchy, you'll see that several spheres were created, but instead of creating and deleting them, it just keeps reusing them. If you look closely, you'll see that they are being disabled and re-enabled as needed. Also, if I select the ObjectSpawner and you look at my inspector, you can see that the max spawn attempts is 1, which means we're getting 100% success rate on our spawns, which means we also don't have any bad spawns.